So for our third session, we have Sam White, who is a physician and the newest member of China Rock Ventures, CRCM. So I just looked on the portfolio, list of portfolio companies. We actually were both in L, that was acquired by Procter & Gamble.
Yep.
In addition to Ginkgo Bioworks, which is a great investment on your part, and that I've benefited a lot from. So I wanted to get your perspective, because even though you're just joining CRCM, you've been consulting for them for the last 2 years. So you actually have quite a bit of experience on the healthcare and biotech side. So what does CRCM look for in companies, and what should the founders be aware of when they're pitching?
Great. Well, first off, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. But yeah, I mean, I guess to kind of discuss some of the things that we think about and we look for when we are meeting with companies, there's kind of a list that I like to go through, and it's not comprehensive. But the first thing is that after I've met with the company, I like to sit down and I want to be able to kind of write out what I think that company's long-term vision is. And it's important to me for a couple of reasons. The first thing is that if I can't actually write out in 1 or 2 sentences what I think that company's long-term vision is, then I probably didn't ask the right questions. And I need to go back and I need to get more information because I just don't have enough to make that first decision. Or the second thing is that the company itself doesn't actually know what their long-term vision is, which can be problematic. So I think that it's important to have that kind of laid out and to make that clear, especially during the first meeting. And to kind of go off that as well, one of the other things I look for is I want to be able to define the problem that the company is trying to address. And I think that this is important for a couple of reasons. The first one is that essentially, I think there's a benefit to being able or trying to tackle really large problems that are both challenging, but they're problems that if they're solved can meaningfully impact a large number of individuals, or impact maybe a smaller number of individuals who are suffering a lot. And the reason I think it's an advantage to be kind of targeting these large problems is that if you have a solution that is actually successfully addressing these, you're going to end up having a lot of shareholders whose interests are aligned in the success of your company. And if you're impacting a lot of individuals and you're solving a major problem, you're likely to be very successful as a business as well. On the flip side, if you don't have a problem that you're addressing, then I think you're going to have a lot of challenges, trying to fit your technology or whatever it is that you're developing with the customer, and you're going to have kind of a lack of focus, which can ultimately kind of pull you in too many directions as you're essentially you have a product, but you don't really know what the use of the product is for, and you're trying to force kind of a fit. The next thing that we kind of look for is a technical advantage or an edge that a company has. And that can be, a hard science advantage, hardware, computational edge, or some combination of these things together. And the reason this is important is because it serves as a differentiator, especially early on when you haven't had the time to kind of build up partnerships, to build brand reputation, all things that ultimately kind of build to your moat. Those things take time. And I think early on, if you can have that kind of that computational or technical edge, you'll have kind of that moat in place, and then you can build on it. Whereas if you don't have that, then I think you run the risk of lacking the differentiators, and then you're more likely to get stuck, kind of competing where you don't necessarily have something that is a good differentiator, for your company versus other companies. And then it's also important that the technology or whatever platform or whatever it is that your company is building be something that's actually commercially viable. So is it, you have to go beyond just this is a really interesting scientific discovery to there's actually this actually makes sense as a business. The unit economics actually makes sense as a business. It might not right now, but I guess down the road can it make sense. And then the last thing, and I actually think that you and I probably would agree a lot on this one because we've talked about it, is the importance of the team.
Yeah.
And I think that, you can have the most amazing, product ever. But if you don't have the right team to execute on that product and kind of bring that business to fruition, it's just not going to work out. So I think that it's really important that you have kind of the right team of individuals that have kind of been put in place to kind of help bring your idea and make it a reality.
I completely agree on all of them. There's a quote that I really like, which is vision without execution is hallucination. So I keep that in mind. And then I've been an investing geek since I was 11, so I track a lot of famous investors, and Julian Robertson, among others. They're famous for telling their analysts, if you cannot explain this on the back of an envelope, and these are the small envelopes, not the big ones,
Yeah.
you don't understand what you own, right? So I totally agree with you that even though there are a lot of details and a lot of facts that you should be checking, the fundamental thesis actually boils down to 3 bullet points usually. So totally agree with you.
Yeah.
So I think we might have already you might have already touched on this, which is, are there the founding team, but are there specific personality traits, or is it more the technology and the execution?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess to kind of dive a little bit more into kind of the team and what we were looking for specifically, I don't think there's necessarily kind of a one size fits all for, we're not someone who's like, well, you have to have an MBA or business person be CEO, and you have to have a scientist as a CTO. I think for us, it's more having kind of the right blend of expertise to actually be able to tackle, the problems that your company's going to be facing in kind of the specific market that you're addressing. And then you also need to have, and I think that this is equally as important, you kind of have to have the right relationships between both the direct team members, so that the co-founders and any early employees, but also all the indirect relationships. And that includes the investors you're bringing on, advisors, mentors, everyone else who's kind of indirectly related to the company. And I think, and just because of the space that we're investing in, I think it's kind of worth touching on when it comes to companies in kind of the biotech space. I think the kind of classic model a lot of people will initially think of is that you have kind of some business person or an MBA coming in, licensing tech from some university or lab, and then growing a business from that. And I think people can be very successful doing that, and I'm not trying to put that down as kind of a bad, as something that we don't look for. But I also don't want people who are scientists, individuals who are doctors, healthcare workers, et cetera, to be discouraged from becoming an entrepreneur. Because I actually think that a lot of the skill set that scientists have, or healthcare workers, actually is an advantage, or it can be translated very easily to starting a business. For example, PhDs, running a lab, constantly have to face failure, where they have, an experiment that doesn't turn out quite as expected. Then they have to sit down, analyze what happened, learn from it, and then iterate on that.
Yeah.
And that kind of problem-solving iterative process, I think, is really can be applied to business as well. So if we see scientists as CEOs, that is for us, it can often be a positive, not a red flag.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I also think that business is actually quite simple. It's not easy, but it's very simple. It's you can learn it. So having looked through the last 2 years of CRCM, if you look at the companies that were very successful versus ones that are less so, what are the differentiating factors?
Sure. Yeah. So thinking back, there's definitely a lot of things, kind of factors that influence the success. But looking for kind of common threads, I guess, between companies that we've invested in that have done very well, I'd say there's probably kind of 3 things I think that are worth highlighting. The first thing is, I think that the founders who are driven not just by financial incentives, and I think it's important that companies actually have good financial incentives in place, but they're also driven by the kind of passion for the subject matter that's related to the company that they're in, or the impact that the company might have. I think gives them an edge in being able to be resilient and kind of stick with the company over time. I think it's generally fairly rare for a startup, especially early on, to have like a really smooth process. There's going to be challenges. There's going to be periods of time where maybe your fundraising and an investor drops out last minute, or different hiccups that are kind of unexpected. And at the end of the day, if you're in it because you really care about building this company, it's much easier, I think, to kind of handle those and kind of be optimistic, be resilient, and keep going. And if you can kind of stick with it, I think that that's a big advantage ultimately in getting a company to market or successful exit or whatever it is the goal your goal is as an entrepreneur. The second thing is adaptability.
Yeah, which is the other side of the coin.
Which is it's kind of the other side of the coin for sure. And I think that it applies both to the team, but I also think that it applies to the product or whatever the company is building. So from the team side, again, as you're kind of hitting these challenges, so maybe initially on you have kind of an end consumer in mind or end customer, but over time the customer's needs change and adapt. And so what they were originally maybe are slightly different now. And so being able as a team to kind of adapt to the changing environment, the changing market you're within, is very important. And then the product itself, I think it also needs to be adaptable. And I think that, and what I kind of mean by that is that there needs to be some sort of optionality where if you essentially have a product and you can't change it at all, essentially, so this is the product, this is the end target, and the end target moves, if you can't actually adopt or have optionality to adjust, then I think that it's pretty risky. Doesn't mean it can't happen. It just means that if there's no ability to kind of change or adjust your product, that you can be stuck ultimately with no consumer at the end. Yeah. So I think the team and product adaptability is important. And then the third thing I think is focus. And this I think ties back kind of a little bit into what I was saying, both with kind of having a vision for the company and addressing a problem. And I think that if you essentially don't really understand what your end goal is, it's much harder to kind of maintain momentum. Because you can, if you don't have a problem you're trying to solve, you don't have an end goal, you can get kind of pulled in too many directions where you're trying to spend too much time trying to fit, let me try this market or this market. Let's figure out essentially where it seems to stick, rather than being like, all right, this is what we want to achieve with this. And then let's kind of work within this framework and make sure that each step is at least taking us closer to the end target, rather than, spending money and wasting time in areas that really have no kind of meaningful relation to what your end goal is. So I would say those kind of three things, I think are probably, pretty common between, the companies that have been successful that we've invested in.
I did get asked a couple times by founders, which is, they felt like they were being pushed in both directions, which is be persistent, but be adaptable and pivot, right? And I think the solution there is really, you have to be persistent about solving a particular problem, but be very adaptable on the various solutions to solve it. So that might be pivoting your product, right? But you're staying very consistent with your customers and the problem that they're suffering from.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, no. So what I mean by kind of like a long-term vision or goal is not that like, the product needs to be exactly this, but it's more like what difference are you trying to make? What solution are you trying to solve? And then the adaptability comes in kind of essentially, adapting the solution to kind of solve that problem or reach that target.
Yeah. I think that's actually something that is actually particular to biotech and devices, which is, in these two areas, we think of them as product companies, but in essence, there are services companies, because customers buy a solution and not a product. They don't really care what your product is, right? They just want to solve their problem. So absolutely agree with that. So the reason why I really wanted to interview you is actually because you're a physician user, right? I think, most VCs don't have the physician background that you do. So what's your perspective on, some of the products and some of the tech that you've seen?
Yeah, so, I think one thing that's probably worth discussing, because it's relevant, for entrepreneurs, and something that I've noticed being kind of, I guess, on both sides of the coin, is, and something that I think a lot of companies actually make this mistake, and that essentially is that they assume that the product they're developing, whether it's some sort of, digital application that's supposed to be utilized in clinics or hospitals, they assume that the kind of intrinsic value of that app is just somehow going to be realized, by the physicians, by the hospital, and then will just be adopted. And they don't spend enough time thinking about the workflow and how the adoption of their technology might change that workflow. And then the behaviors that essentially, are going to have to, adapt and change in order to accommodate their technology. And this is relevant, I think, in a lot of fields, but I think in particular in healthcare, where you essentially, things move very slowly, and you have these workflows that are ingrained very early on in your training as, as a physician or, really any healthcare worker, that they get kind of reinforced throughout your training. And I think that people make the mistake that somehow their application just on, alone is going to be what's going to drive all of this change.
Yeah.
So, I'll give kind of just like an example. Say you've like a cloud-based analytics program, and maybe it has some predictive algorithm for determining likelihood of like patients crashing on the floor, and maybe it derives some really interesting insights. But if that isn't integrated into the workflow of the healthcare team on those units where it's being utilized, you can derive the best insights ever. It can be 100% accurate, but if no one's actually acting on those insights, because you haven't changed behavior, because it's not seamlessly integrated, then the outcomes aren't going to change. And at the end of the day, a hospital or whomever's paying for your technology, they care about the end outcome. And if you're not driving changes in the end outcome, even though you have good insights, they're going to stop paying for that. Yeah. And it's not going to be adopted. And I think there's kind of two things that kind of connect to that, or two things that people mistakenly assume changes physician behavior or will change physician behavior. And that is usually that people assume that financial incentives will change physician behavior and that data will automatically change physician behavior. And I think, they'll have the company, they'll say, oh, look, like this will save the hospital this amount of money, or this will, this physician group can make a little bit more if they adopt my practice. And there's an interesting book I read called Drive. I'm forgetting the name of the author, but I definitely recommend it. And it essentially discusses kind of human behavior and the motivations behind the decisions that we make. And what that book found is that there's a kind of a whole list of things that influence behavioral changes much more so than money. Money really kind of falls low down on the list, which was definitely surprising for me. And to give some examples, there's things like what they call like task identity, which is essentially what does your work actually accomplish? Task significance. So how does your work impact other people? The feedback you get from your work. So do you especially as a physician, I think a lot of physicians enjoy what they do because they can help someone, they can make them feel better, and getting that kind of feedback is immensely rewarding. And then autonomy. Yeah. So those are just, I think, a few things that are generally considered to be, or were found anyways, and based on the study, to be more motivating than kind of financial incentives. Yeah. And then data. Physicians get, and a lot of healthcare workers are absolutely bombarded with a tremendous amount of data. And I think a large part of that is you have these kind of large electronic medical record systems that were originally designed to be essentially data storage, for all the paper, files that were being digitized. And then they found, all right, well, we need to be able to access these. So they built this interface. And you kind of have this ad hoc systems that have kind of been cobbled together to try to provide some sort of functionality for physicians to provide some insights. But the reality is, if you go onto like a patient chart and you go through the notes, the vast majority of what you're looking at is really kind of meaningless information that is just an absolute pain to kind of sift through. So just by throwing more data at someone who's already kind of data overloaded is not going to be something that's going to be incentivizing for them, even if that data is actually very valuable data. It's just hard for them to see that. So I think a better approach is, rather than just to provide data, you provide insights and recommendations based on those insights. So instead of saying, here's a list of patients with elevated blood sugar, why don't you say, here's a list of patients that you know you need to intervene on and why, and these are our recommended actions and why, and then maybe you provide some sort of operational support for those. You know, that type of information is, you know, much more valuable than just, you know, having kind of a whole list of, you know, oh, we captured really, you know, amazing, you know, I guess data looking at heart rhythms. It's like, well, that's great, but you know, that's just, you know, you're just adding to the list of things that have to be sifted through. So yeah, I think that's something that I think a lot of companies sometimes get wrong.
Yep. I totally agree with you. I think what you said about drive probably applies even more for millennials and the younger generation. I did a study for an insurance company, an auto insurance company, to your point about, you know, really thinking about the user. And I think this is even more important for physicians is we found that auto insurers, they actually come to your website because they need to buy insurance because it's state mandated. But even then, we start losing customers after the third question, and we've lost most of the customers by the seventh question. And so it's just something, I mean, before that study, I never thought about UX, but literally I did that study and UX is that important. And I think especially when your user is a physician, physicians are always, you know, crammed for time. So very glad you pointed that out. And another data point I had on sort of making it ease of use is I only know 2 other physician investors, and it's very interesting that they actually ask for the questions that I've heard them ask is, what's the CPT code? Which, you know, and in thinking back, it makes complete sense, right? Is that I don't, you know, your product can be the best product ever, but if there's no billing code, you're not going to get, you know, some sort of payment. So I thought that was the other highlight.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think although it's starting to change a lot, and you know, unfortunately, I think with COVID's being accelerated, well, COVID's unfortunate. I think some of the acceleration, but yeah, there's starting to be more kind of reimbursement codes for you know remote patient monitoring, telehealth, you know, these different areas, but yeah, it's definitely something that a lot of people I think sometimes forget to think or kind of look into. You know, they've got this exciting idea, but again, that kind of comes back to the, you know, can you actually make a business out of this? So
yeah, exactly. So yeah, so you are the brand new VC. I wanted to hear if you had any questions for me or for, you know, the general field. How can we welcome you?
yes, so I actually had a couple questions, and I think these are particularly relevant actually for you because you know, just from experience being, you know, kind of co-investors in a few companies, I've kind of noticed this that, you know, that you're very you know, kind of supportive. You spend a lot of time working and kind of helping build these companies. So I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts on kind of what are some of the best ways that VC firms can kind of best support their portfolio companies. And then also, you know, just to make sure that it's still kind of relevant for entrepreneurs, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you think entrepreneurs should kind of be looking for in the venture capital firms that they're choosing to kind of onboard as investors.
Yeah. I'll start with the second question, which is, you know, the advice I've heard from some of the bigger firms is actually, you know, pick your VC, not your VC firm, right? Is that, you know, the basically the person that you're going to be interacting with is going to matter more. So that's, you know, the first piece of advice I have for founders. And I guess as a VC, I really think regardless of if you're at a small firm or if you're an angel investor, once you've invested in a company, you are a services firm, a free services firm, right? And so I've been on a couple of panels and I joke that, you know, I write a check to buy the privilege of giving you free labor, right? And it's a joke, but it's actually, there's a lot of truth to it. Is, you know, I learned to code in a language to help out a portfolio company in order to sort of both evaluate AI companies, but also to be a pinch hitter, you know, programmer. I got certified in machine learning and neural networks, right? And so it's, you know, it took up months and months of my weekends, but you do it. So I think, you know, there are definitely some VCs that are having luxurious lifestyles, but that's not like, I think most VCs I know are working all the time. So it is one of those jobs where, you know, we're giving free CFO services. I'm connecting one of the portfolio companies with a big retail brand, just to, sign another big contract, right? And I think as a VC, you really can't think of it as, well, what do I get out of it? It's really that you've already invested in this company, so making it a success does benefit everyone. So I think it's just, helping them any way you can. And I think the other thing, I really tell founders this is, don't think of VCs as your boss. Because if you do that, you're going to stop talking to them, right? And then you're only going to talk to them when something goes wrong. So then the VC is going to think, oh, there's just going to be a negative association. So I think, I usually just reach out to the founders every few months and just check in, and if the answer I get is fine, I will dig some more. Like, how's this product going? Have you talked to this customer yet? Have you thought about, and I'm always sending them, whether it's articles, new studies and whatnot. And, half the time is super helpful. The other half the time, they ignore it, but yeah. But I mean, I hope that answers your question. I really think of myself as free labor, especially at the stage that we're investing in. They don't have their own CFO. They don't have their own headhunter. And so I was literally trying to tap 3 different fermentation strain engineers. These are not people in my network, but, I just because it's rather than the founders spending their time, it's better that I spend my time and try to do recruiting for them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that makes sense. And I think and it's something we've actually talked about before, but, and I think would probably be something that I would think that entrepreneurs should look for in kind of the VCs that they're going to be, interacting with are people who actually get excited about what they're doing.
Yeah.
You want someone who's like, they're kind of, they've seen what you're doing. They see the problem that you're trying to tackle, and they genuinely are they're excited about it. They want to be involved in that. And I think that is probably a characteristic or something that you would want to look for as well.
Yeah. And this is something that everyone talks about, which is, this is a longer term commitment than a marriage. It's not someone that you have to deal with every day, but it's definitely a longer term commitment than some marriages. So it's, I think the whole, can I talk to this person? Can I trust this person when something goes wrong are definitely questions to think about.
Absolutely.
Awesome. So, we covered a lot of topics. So what are sort of 3 main points for a founder that is building a biotech startup that will hopefully come and pitch to both of us?
Yeah. No, I think it's a very good question. And the reason I actually kind of like thinking about takeaways, it kind of goes back actually to a lecturer I had in medical school who would always end his, lectures with like, these are the 3 takeaways he thinks you should have. And the reason is that on average, about a day after you've heard a lecture, you've already forgotten about 70 to 80% of that. And within a week, it's like you're down to maybe 5%. And within a month, there's like maybe 1% or 2% that you actually remember. So by having just a couple takeaways, if you can hopefully remember a few things, I would say the first thing is I think it's important that you're solving a real problem. I think ultimately, if that's the case, you're more likely to have good customer fit at the end of the day, and you're more likely to be sticky. The second thing is be deliberate about who you work with, both with your direct team. Make sure that you are surrounding yourself with people who are doing it for the right reasons, that there's kind of shared drive, and also with the indirect team. So make sure you're bringing on the right advisors, the right VC firms, to kind of surround yourself with. And then the last thing is probably is to select an area that you're passionate about. Build a company in an area that you actually care about, and I think that's going to. That's probably advice you should take for any job that you're doing. But I think at the end of the day, starting a company is challenging and it's very hard. And if you are excited about what you're doing and what you're building, it's going to feel way easier, and you're going to be able to stick with it when things get challenging.
Yep. I don't have 3. I only have 2. I'd say Biotech and Symbio, I'll combine them together. I think in particular for these two areas, I would actually advise the founders to actually think about the cost it takes for your first commercialization, for your first revenue, because these two areas are very different from, software, right? Software, you just
Yeah.
have a couple of programmers, you're sort of, you have an MVP that you can launch. You may not be able to charge for it, but you can launch something. Whereas I think for biotech is very different, and for devices is also very different. And so understanding, how many zeros are in the cost side before you can get to commercialization is important. You're not going to be right, but understanding how many zeros is a good piece of information to have, because you will be asked about it, if not at seed, but definitely Series A. I'd say the second one is, I think that's the big one actually, but the second one is somewhat related, which is actually knowing what your competition is, right?
Yeah.
Is that I think especially with Symbio, with biotech, there are big pockets working on these things, right? And so these are divisions within these big organizations. And I know it's extremely hard to get information on that, but like investors will try, either with your help or without your help, because the last thing you want is to write a $5 million check when Bayer has already been working on has already spent 200 million on it and is going to push out a product in 6 months, right? And so the more the more you come across as really knowledgeable in the space, and the more VCs will probably trust you. So those are my only 2 points.
Great. Well, I think those are both two very, very good points.
Yeah, I look forward to co-investing with you. Yeah, welcome.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And I appreciate you taking the time to have me on to kind of discuss these things.
Yeah, welcome to the Bay Area. I know you haven't made it out here yet, but once the states are open, we will do a real welcome drinks.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I look forward to it. So
sounds good.
But yeah, thank you again.
Thank you.